She walked into the place where women did not stay, and in the first heartbeat of the story it was clear that if she remained, something in her would be lost forever. Not her safety, not her reputation. Something quieter and more dangerous, the last fragile part of her that still believed love could be gentle. She was not being followed. No one was looking for her. The threat was inside her, and it had been growing for years. The camera of the city caught her in fragments. Rain on glass, neon slicing across wet pavement, her reflection breaking and reforming in every window. She did not hurry. She did not hesitate. This was not escape. This was a decision. She had chosen a place known for one thing only: intensity without aftermath, a territory of closeness without belonging, of heat without shelter. People came here when they no longer wanted to explain themselves to the future. She knew exactly what it offered, and more importantly, what it refused to give. No promises, no continuity, no language of tomorrow. In the first seconds, the audience did not yet know her name or her history, but they could feel the risk of what she was doing. She was stepping into something that would not protect her, and she was doing it deliberately. She was not running from a man. She was running from the version of herself that still hoped men would one day choose her completely. The woman who had waited for doors to close and had learned, too slowly, that some men only loved with one foot already turned toward the exit. She had not been betrayed in any dramatic way. No scandal, no public collapse. What had hollowed her out was quieter, years of being welcomed but never centered, desired but never anchored. She had been the woman who fit into lives without reshaping them. The woman who could be loved as long as love did not require sacrifice. Her exhaustion was not loud. It was surgical. It had cut away illusions piece by piece until what remained was a woman who no longer trusted softness. She had learned how to be convenient, how to be flexible, how to love without asking for permanence. At first, she had called this strength, independence, modern intimacy. But over time, she began to notice what it cost her, how she edited her needs, how she made herself smaller to remain acceptable, how she learned to want less so that rejection would hurt less. By the time she stood on the rain-darkened sidewalk outside the building, love no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a negotiation she always lost. The entrance did not announce itself as dangerous. There were no warnings, no visible thresholds. It was framed by glass and light, by a suggestion of invitation that never turned into belonging. People passed through the doors the way others passed through bars, hotels, or confessional booths, not to build something, but to forget something. She recognized it immediately for what it was: a place designed to absorb longing and release it without residue, to offer proximity without responsibility, to allow the body to be present while the future remained untouched. She did not pause because she was afraid. She paused because she understood what crossing that line meant. Once inside, there would be no narrative to hide behind, no story of potential, no comforting idea of where this is going. Whatever happened would exist only in the moment. For a woman who had spent years living in relationships defined by almosts and laters, that finality felt brutal and unexpectedly merciful. Her past did not contain a single wound that could be pointed to and named as the cause of this choice. It was not one man who had broken her. It was the repetition of the same pattern, refined over time. Men who enjoyed her presence but protected their autonomy, who spoke of connection while structuring their lives so that she remained optional. Each ending had been reasonable. Each explanation had sounded mature. But what they shared was a quiet cruelty. She had never been fought for. She had been accommodated. She had learned to read the signs long before the men themselves admitted them. The careful avoidance of permanence. The language of freedom that always applied more to them than to her. The way she was introduced into their lives as something that could be removed without collapse. She had told herself this was the price of modern love. That needing less made her stronger. But strength, she was beginning to understand, had become another form of self-erasure. Rain gathered in the seams of her coat, soaking through fabric that had once been chosen carefully for dates, dinners, the soft rituals of connection. Now it clung to her like a reminder that she was still physical, still vulnerable to sensation even as she tried to become immune to expectation. Her hands were cold, the kind of cold that did not hurt sharply but spread slowly, numbing. It felt appropriate. She was entering a place that promised intensity without warmth. Inside, the atmosphere altered her sense of time. Light fractured across reflective surfaces. Movement was constant but detached, bodies circulating without collision, eyes meeting without invitation. The space was designed for immediacy. Nothing here suggested tomorrow. No one asked who she was or where she was going after this. She was not seen as a story. She was registered as presence. That distinction unsettled her and at the same time brought a strange calm. She did not come seeking a particular person. She did not scan the room for connection in the way she once had. The choice she had made was not about being wanted by someone else. It was about what she would allow herself to become in a place that refused continuity. She was here to test whether feeling could exist without hope attached to it, whether desire could be honest when stripped of future. It was not self-destruction that led her. It was exhaustion with the half-love she had been living. Her body responded before her mind could interfere, not with hunger but with awareness, the sound of her steps, the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing adjusted to the rhythm of the room. She was no longer performing intimacy. She was inhabiting herself. The knowledge that she would not be asked to define this moment later was a relief she had not anticipated. She could be present without preparing an explanation. She remembered the years when she had equated proximity with closeness, how she had mistaken shared space for shared direction, how she had offered access to her inner life as if generosity would be mistaken for worth. She had believed that openness would lead to being chosen. Instead, it had taught others how easily she could be placed on the margins. Here, openness was irrelevant. No one needed her story. No one needed her promise. Presence was enough. What unsettled her was not the absence of romance, but the precision of its absence. There was no pretense in this place. No suggestion that what occurred here would become something else. In a world where she had spent years negotiating meaning, the starkness of that honesty felt almost sacred. It allowed her to stop rehearsing futures that never arrived. She felt both exposed and protected by the anonymity. No one here knew the history that had shaped her. No one expected consistency. She was permitted to exist without context. That permission was intoxicating. It allowed her to imagine herself not as a woman defined by relationships that had failed to fully claim her, but as a presence capable of sensation without consequence. She did not romanticize what she was doing. She knew this place could not give her what she once wanted. It would not offer partnership or safety or the slow architecture of shared time. What it offered was something harsher and, to her, more honest. Closeness without narrative, attraction without contract, feeling without the promise of endurance. For someone worn thin by years of partial attachment, that honesty felt like the last form of dignity available. As she moved deeper inside, the city outside receded, not physically but emotionally. The world of routines, of careful compromises and polite separations, lost its gravity. In its place was a landscape governed by immediacy. She recognized the paradox of her choice. She had come to a space defined by transience in order to escape the slow erosion of herself that had occurred in relationships meant to last. The realization did not frighten her. It steadied her. A part of her mourned what she had once believed love could be. Not the fantasy of perfect union, but the quieter hope of being chosen without conditions, of being wanted not for how well she fit, but for who she was when she stopped adjusting herself to remain palatable. That hope had not been destroyed. It had simply become too painful to carry into spaces where it was never answered. Here, she did not have to protect it. Here, she could lay it down. She became more present with each step, less divided between what she felt and what she feared it might mean. The tension that had lived in her body for years loosened. Her breathing slowed, not from comfort but from acceptance. Whatever happened here would belong only to now. It would not follow her. It would not demand interpretation. The simplicity of that boundary made it possible for her to remain. She understood that this choice would mark her, not in a way she would announce, not as a story she would tell, but as a recalibration of what she would be willing to accept from intimacy. By choosing a place where one could not stay, she was admitting something about herself. She was no longer willing to offer permanence to those who could not offer it in return. If connection was to exist in her life again, it would either be honest or it would be absent. There would be no more half measures. The night outside continued its indifferent movement. Inside, time felt suspended, not frozen but unburdened by expectation. She stood within that suspension and allowed herself to be exactly where she was, without rehearsing an exit, without imagining a tomorrow that required her to become smaller. She had come to a place where staying was impossible, and in that impossibility she found a rare kind of truth. She did not yet know what this truth would cost her. She only knew that remaining in the life she had been living had already cost too much. To be the woman who was always almost chosen had hollowed her in ways no dramatic heartbreak ever could. Here, at the threshold of a world that promised intensity without future, she stepped forward. Not because it was safe, not because it was romantic, but because, for the first time in years, it did not require her to pretend that being half-loved was enough. She disappeared into the interior not as an act of surrender but as an assertion. She was done negotiating the terms of her own worth. If love was to exist for her again, it would have to meet her without conditions. Until then, she would inhabit places that asked nothing of her except presence. In a world that had taught her to be grateful for crumbs of attention, she chose a different hunger. Not for belonging, but for truth, even if that truth burned and did not stay. He did not appear in the way she had been taught to recognize men. There was no narrative attached to him, no aura of approachability, no visible intention to be understood. He did not arrive as a promise. He arrived as a disturbance in the quiet structure she had built around herself. From the moment she became aware of him, something in her perception shifted. It was not attraction in the familiar sense, not the soft curiosity that preceded desire. It was a tightening, a sense that the internal order she relied on had been challenged by a presence that refused categorization. He did not look at her as though she were a possibility. He looked at her as though she already existed in a way that did not require permission. There was no invitation in his attention, no attempt to draw her in through charm or vulnerability. What unsettled her was not that he wanted her, but that he did not seem to want anything from her in the way she understood wanting. His interest did not seek to possess. It did not ask to be acknowledged. It simply existed, steady and unapologetic, as though he were observing something he recognized without needing to define it. She was accustomed to being seen through frameworks men carried into their encounters with women. The caretaker, the inspiration, the complication, the refuge, the temporary escape. Even in the spaces where identity was supposed to dissolve, she had always felt herself being placed somewhere, assigned a shape that made her legible to others. With him, there was no such placement. He did not ask who she was, and more importantly, he did not seem to require an answer in order to remain interested. She was not a role to be filled. She was simply there, and that was enough. This absence of framing disturbed her more than any overt intensity could have. She had learned to navigate desire when it was structured by expectation. She knew how to respond when men approached her with stories already written in their minds. What she did not know how to handle was a tension that came without narrative. It left her without a script. It forced her into a space of immediacy she had been carefully avoiding. He did not attempt to soften his presence. There was nothing in him that suggested he wished to be comforting. His stillness was not gentle. It was deliberate. Where others adjusted their behavior in subtle ways to accommodate her reactions, he did not alter himself. He did not lean in or pull back in response to what he sensed in her. He remained as he was, unmodulated by her uncertainty. This was not indifference. It was a refusal to perform. She became aware of him not through interaction, but through the way the air around him seemed to change the rhythm of the space. It was as if something in the environment had recalibrated itself in his presence. Her body registered this before her mind did. A tightening in her chest, a slight disruption in her breathing. Not fear exactly, but an alertness she had not felt in years. She had come here to be unburdened by expectation. Instead, she found herself confronted by a man who seemed to see past the careful emptiness she had cultivated. What unsettled her most was that he did not appear interested in the version of herself she had perfected. He did not engage with the composure she wore like armor. He did not respond to the distance she used to protect herself from being seen too clearly. His attention did not graze the surface of her presence. It rested somewhere deeper, in a place she had not intended to expose. It was not invasive. It was exact. She realized, with a jolt of clarity, that he was not perceiving her as a woman searching for connection. He saw her as someone who already knew the cost of solitude and had chosen it anyway. This was not the gaze of a man who wanted to rescue or conquer. It was the gaze of someone who recognized a familiar terrain in another person. A recognition that did not require explanation. A recognition that was, in itself, a form of intimacy. Between them, what formed was not conversation, but a shared silence that carried more weight than words. There was no exchange of histories, no careful positioning of identities. The tension did not arise from what they said to each other. It arose from what remained unspoken. Their awareness of one another existed in glances that did not seek confirmation, in the subtle alignment of attention that required no gesture to sustain it. It was not tender. It was precise. She had been drawn to men before. She had known the familiar arc of attraction, the slow discovery, the mutual shaping of expectation, the gradual layering of meaning. This was different. There was no progression, no sense of building toward something. The connection existed fully formed in the present, without reference to what it might become. It was not a promise. It was a fact. He did not offer her safety. There was nothing in him that suggested he wished to provide shelter, emotional or otherwise. In his presence, she did not feel protected. She felt seen in a way that stripped away the comfort of her defenses. The absence of reassurance was not accidental. It was integral to who he was. He did not soften the edges of what passed between them. He did not attempt to make the intensity manageable. He allowed it to exist without translation. This was the first real fracture in the structure she had brought with her into this place. She had chosen a space defined by impermanence because it promised intensity without consequence. She had believed she could enter, experience, and leave without being altered. With him, that assumption collapsed. There was nothing in his presence that suggested he would follow the rules of the environment. He did not treat the moment as something to be consumed and discarded. He did not appear bound by the logic of transience that governed the space. His attention did not exist in a vacuum. It carried weight. She found herself confronted with a question she had not anticipated. What did it mean to be seen without being framed by desire's usual narratives? There was no suggestion that he wanted to possess her. There was no indication that he wished to be possessed by her. And yet, the connection between them felt more destabilizing than any hunger she had known. It was not built on need. It was built on recognition. She became acutely aware of the parts of herself she had learned to keep hidden, the instinct to retreat, the habit of controlling the depth of her own exposure. With him, these strategies felt suddenly inadequate. He did not push against them. He simply did not respond to them. The distance she usually created to maintain her autonomy did not register as a boundary to him. He did not cross it. He did not acknowledge it. He remained present on the other side of it, as though it were irrelevant. Her mind searched for ways to situate him within familiar categories. Protector, predator, lover, stranger, none of these fit. He did not seek to claim her, nor did he attempt to use her. His interest did not move along the lines of power she recognized. It was neither dominating nor submissive. It existed outside the hierarchies that had shaped her past experiences. This lack of orientation made her uneasy. Without a map, she did not know how to position herself. She realized that what drew her was not his mystery, but his refusal to perform accessibility. He did not make himself easy to approach. He did not offer emotional cues that invited interpretation. He did not present himself as a problem to be solved or a story to be uncovered. He existed as a presence that did not require understanding in order to be felt. This was what destabilized her, the sense that something real was occurring without the mediation of explanation. She had spent years constructing a version of herself that could move through relationships without being undone by them. She had learned to maintain control by managing the narrative of her own vulnerability. With him, narrative was irrelevant. There was no story being told, no future being implied. The connection existed entirely in the present, and that present was too sharp to be comfortable. She felt the instinct to withdraw, not because she was uninterested, but because she recognized the risk. To remain in the presence of someone who did not offer safety was to confront the possibility of being altered without consent. He did not threaten her physically or emotionally. The threat was subtler. It was the threat of being seen beyond the constructs she had used to protect herself, of being known without being defined. What unsettled her further was that he did not seem to be testing her. There was no sense that he was waiting for a response, no anticipation of her reaction. His attention was not contingent on her engagement. It did not escalate or retreat based on what she offered. It simply remained. This constancy was more disarming than any pursuit could have been. She was not being courted. She was being recognized. She became aware of a shift within herself that she had not experienced in years. The familiar patterns of self-regulation began to falter. The careful moderation of feeling, the instinct to intellectualize attraction, the impulse to maintain emotional distance, all of these strategies felt suddenly transparent, inadequate in the face of a presence that did not respond to them. She was being drawn not by what he offered, but by what he refused to provide: reassurance, narrative, promise. In his presence, she could not remain the version of herself that had learned to survive on half measures of intimacy. That version depended on relationships that allowed her to maintain control by keeping the stakes low. With him, the stakes were undefined, and that was precisely what made the encounter dangerous. There was no contract to protect her, no expectation to guide her, only the immediacy of a connection that did not soften itself to be endured. She did not know where he came from or what he wanted beyond the moment. She did not know what his history contained or what his future might hold. None of this seemed to matter to him, and increasingly it began to feel irrelevant to her as well. The absence of context did not weaken the intensity between them. It sharpened it. Without the cushioning of story, what remained was raw awareness. She understood, with a clarity that bordered on dread, that proximity to him would not allow her to remain unchanged. This was not the familiar transformation that accompanied romance, the gradual reshaping of identity through shared experience. This was something more immediate, more fundamental. To be near him was to feel the edges of her carefully constructed self begin to loosen. The control she had prized was being undermined not by force, but by the presence of something that did not acknowledge its authority. She had come to a place designed for encounters that dissolved as easily as they formed. She had believed she could participate in intensity without consequence. In him, she encountered a contradiction to that belief. He was not bound by the rules of the environment. He did not approach the moment as something disposable. His attention did not suggest continuation, but it also did not suggest detachment. It existed in a state she could not easily categorize, fully present without promise. This was what made him impossible to resist, not because he offered fulfillment, but because he offered confrontation. He did not invite her into comfort. He invited her into awareness. The tension between them was not erotic in the conventional sense. It was existential. It was the friction that occurs when two people recognize something essential in each other that neither has language for. She felt a quiet, insistent understanding settle within her. Beside him, she would not be able to maintain the distance that had defined her emotional life. She would not be able to remain the woman who loved without demanding, who desired without expecting. He did not require her to change. He simply existed in a way that made her previous strategies untenable. In that realization lay both fear and attraction. To step closer to him was to step into a space where control could no longer be guaranteed. To remain where she was meant returning to the safety of a self that had been slowly eroded by compromise. The pull she felt toward him was not toward what he might give her, but toward what he might take from her. The illusion that she could continue to love without risking her own transformation. He did not promise her anything. He did not offer her a future or even a story to inhabit. And yet, in his presence, she sensed the possibility of something more honest than any connection she had known. Not gentleness, not security, something sharper, more demanding. A recognition that did not soothe, but awakened. She understood then that this man was not a romantic hero. He was a threat to the architecture of her self-control. He did not come to complete her or to save her. He came as a force that would not allow her to remain untouched. In a place designed for people who wished to feel without consequence, he stood as the embodiment of consequence itself. She did not yet know what she would choose. She only knew that whatever lay between them could not be contained within the rules she had brought with her. Near him, she could not stay as she was. And in that danger, in that refusal of safety, she felt the first true pull she had experienced in years. Their connection did not unfold the way stories usually did. It did not progress through discovery or cautious approach. It erupted as friction, as the meeting of two presences that did not seek alignment yet could not remain indifferent to one another. What grew between them was not comfort, not familiarity, not the soft recognition that invited attachment. It was something sharper, something that demanded awareness rather than offering ease. She still tried to preserve the shape of herself. She kept the familiar distance that had once protected her, the careful regulation of how much she allowed to be visible. She had learned how to control depth, how to decide when to withdraw before closeness became too costly. Her body remembered those strategies even when her mind faltered. She limited the spaces where he could enter. She measured her attention. She held her posture with the quiet discipline of someone who had survived intimacy by keeping it partial. But he did not press forward in the ways she expected. He did not invade. He did not challenge her boundaries directly. He simply did not retreat. He remained where he was, unwavering, neither advancing nor withdrawing, as though the distance she attempted to maintain had no relevance to his presence. Where others responded to her hesitation with adjustment or accommodation, he offered none. His constancy became the pressure that made her defenses visible. His presence did not soothe her. It did not reassure. It disturbed the equilibrium she had constructed with such precision. She had entered this world seeking intensity without consequence, feeling without future. Instead, she found herself in proximity to something that did not soften itself to be endured. In his world, closeness did not provide comfort. It stripped. It revealed. It forced attention toward what usually remained hidden. She became aware that what unsettled her was not attraction in the ordinary sense. It was not rooted in desire for his body, nor in the familiar longing to be touched, admired, or chosen. The pull she felt was directed elsewhere, toward a deeper interior terrain she had guarded for most of her life. His interest did not linger on surfaces. It did not rest on what she had learned to present. It reached toward something essential, something she had never allowed another person to approach without transforming it into something safer. For years she had believed she was desired for what she offered. Her intelligence, her composure, her adaptability, her ability to fit seamlessly into other people's lives. She had been wanted for how easily she could be integrated, how little disruption she caused. With him, that logic collapsed. His attention did not settle on what she could provide. It did not seek the parts of her that were functional, pleasing, or manageable. It moved toward the part of her that had always been unmanageable, the part she had hidden not out of modesty, but out of self-preservation. This was what frightened her, not that he wanted her, but that he seemed indifferent to the version of herself she had carefully curated. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical closeness. It was a psychological nakedness, a sense that something in her was being seen without her permission, yet there was no violence in it. He did not pry. He did not interrogate. He simply remained present in a way that made concealment impossible. She noticed how the usual scripts failed her. The gestures she had once relied on to define the nature of an encounter did not alter the dynamic between them. Distance did not cool the tension. Reserve did not transform it into something safer. Even silence did not dissolve it. Their connection existed beneath language, beneath posture, beneath intention. It was not built through exchange. It was simply there, undeniable, immune to the strategies she had perfected. She began to understand that what drew her was not the promise of being wanted, but the experience of being recognized without negotiation. In his presence, she did not feel evaluated. She felt identified, not as a role, not as an object of desire, not as a woman searching for something to fill the absence in her life. She was seen as someone who already knew what it meant to stand alone, who had learned to live within that solitude without romanticizing it. This recognition did not flatter her. It unsettled her. She had always believed that autonomy was preserved through distance, that by limiting what she revealed, she retained control over her own narrative. Near him, this belief began to fracture. She realized that her autonomy had been constructed not through strength, but through avoidance. She had kept herself intact by refusing to allow anyone close enough to disrupt her internal order. He did not seek to disrupt it. His mere presence did so. The more time she spent in proximity to him, the more acutely she felt the boundaries she had drawn around herself. They became visible in a way they had never been before, like outlines illuminated by an unfamiliar light. She could sense the exact points at which she would usually withdraw, the moments where she would choose safety over exposure. Yet with him, withdrawal did not restore equilibrium. It only sharpened the awareness of what she was avoiding. His attention did not move in waves. It did not intensify or recede. It remained constant, neither demanding nor relinquishing. This was what made it so difficult to escape. There was no escalation to respond to, no pursuit to resist. She could not frame him as a threat that needed to be repelled, nor as a desire that needed to be indulged. He existed in a space beyond those categories, and it was precisely this ambiguity that dismantled her defenses. She felt the tension between them as something almost physical, though it did not manifest as touch. It was the awareness of another presence that refused to be absorbed into the background of her experience. Wherever she directed her attention, she could sense him there, not watching in the ordinary sense, but acknowledging. The word that surfaced in her mind was not attraction, but confrontation. Being near him felt like being brought face to face with something in herself she had spent years avoiding. She tried to analyze the nature of what was occurring, to translate it into concepts she could manage. Was it projection? Was it the novelty of encountering someone who did not engage in the familiar rituals of desire? Was it simply the echo of a longing she had suppressed for too long? None of these explanations satisfied her. They reduced the experience to something manageable, and what she was feeling was not manageable. It was exacting. It demanded presence. She became increasingly aware of the contrast between his world and the one she had inhabited. In her previous relationships, closeness had been negotiated through compromise. Boundaries had been softened through reassurance. Emotional intensity had been modulated to preserve stability. In his presence, none of this occurred. There was no attempt to make what passed between them easier. There was no suggestion that the tension needed to be resolved or transformed into something more palatable. It existed in its raw form, unmediated. This lack of mediation was what made the connection so dangerous. Without the familiar frameworks of romance or distance, she was forced to encounter herself without the protective filters she had relied on. She could not intellectualize what she felt. She could not reinterpret it into something less threatening. The experience did not ask for understanding. It demanded awareness. She began to sense the deeper implication of what was happening. To remain near him was to risk a fundamental shift in how she related to others and to herself. It was not that he would change her through influence or persuasion. It was that his presence made her own internal architecture visible, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The habits she had developed to survive intimacy without being consumed by it were no longer invisible. They were exposed as choices rather than necessities. She recognized the instinct to protect herself by withdrawing. It arose again and again, a reflex honed through years of carefully calibrated relationships. Each time, she resisted it not out of recklessness, but out of a growing understanding that what she was avoiding was not him, but herself. The part of her that had learned to exist without asking to be held. The part that had mistaken restraint for independence. She felt a paradox emerge within her. The very thing that frightened her was what drew her closer. The absence of reassurance, the lack of narrative, the refusal of comfort, these qualities did not repel her. They compelled her. She realized that she was not seeking safety in him. She was seeking truth, and truth, she was discovering, did not arrive gently. The attraction between them did not resemble desire as she had known it. It did not build toward consummation or resolution. It remained suspended, unresolved, yet profoundly charged. It was not about fulfillment. It was about recognition. In his presence, she felt the contours of her own interior life more sharply than she ever had in the presence of those who had claimed to love her. This was not because he offered more. It was because he asked nothing. She began to see how deeply her previous relationships had been shaped by mutual avoidance, by the quiet agreement not to demand too much, not to look too closely, not to disturb the fragile balance of autonomy each person protected. With him, there was no such agreement. There was no mutual evasion. There was only the unspoken understanding that what existed between them was not meant to be softened or redefined. She felt exposed not because he had access to her body, but because he seemed to have access to her inner terrain. The place where she had stored her unspoken longings, her unacknowledged grief, her fear of being fully seen and therefore fully vulnerable. He did not articulate any of this. He did not need to. His presence functioned as a mirror she had never asked for but could no longer ignore. The more she became aware of this, the more she understood why the attraction terrified her more than solitude ever had. She had made peace with being alone. She had learned to build a life that did not depend on being chosen. What she had not prepared for was the possibility of encountering someone who did not seek to fill the space of her solitude, but to illuminate it, to stand beside it without attempting to replace it. She realized that the part of her that was being drawn toward him was not the part that desired companionship. It was the part that longed to be known without translation, the part that had grown weary of being interpreted through the expectations of others. With him, there was no interpretation. There was only presence, and in that presence, she felt both diminished and expanded, as though something essential within her was being brought into sharper focus. She tried to imagine what it would mean to move closer, to allow the connection to deepen beyond this charged stasis. The thought did not evoke excitement so much as apprehension. Not of loss, but of exposure. To step closer would be to surrender the control that had defined her emotional life. It would mean allowing herself to be altered not through gradual compromise, but through confrontation with something that could not be negotiated. She understood that what was at stake was not the possibility of being hurt by him, but the certainty of being changed by the encounter. This was not the familiar risk of romantic disappointment. It was a more profound risk, the dismantling of the strategies that had allowed her to love without fully engaging, the loss of the distance that had protected her from being undone. She did not yet know whether she would choose to cross that threshold. What she knew was that remaining in his presence was already eroding the boundaries she had once believed were essential to her survival. The attraction between them was not an invitation to merge, but a challenge to the very architecture of her self-protection. She had come to a place that promised sensation without attachment. In him, she encountered a force that did not respect that promise, not because he sought permanence, but because he embodied a form of closeness that could not be contained within the rules she had chosen. His presence did not offer escape, it offered exposure. She felt the weight of that exposure settle into her with an intensity that was both unbearable and undeniable. It was not something she could consume and leave behind. It was something that demanded a response, even if that response was refusal. To remain unchanged was no longer an option. In the silence that surrounded them, she recognized the truth she had been circling since the moment she first became aware of him. This attraction was not about desire. It was about the collision between who she had become and who she had never allowed herself to be. It was about the breaking of the familiar boundaries that had kept her intact and alone. What frightened her most was not that she might lose herself in him. It was that she might finally encounter the self she had been avoiding. She crossed the threshold not with a single decisive movement, but with a quiet, irreversible shift inside herself. The moment she chose to remain near him, the world did not grow softer. It sharpened. The environment that had once felt suspended, distant from consequence, suddenly acquired weight. Every sensation became more precise, every thought more exacting. What had been tension now became gravity. Staying did not bring relief. It did not calm the unease that had followed her since the first awareness of his presence. Instead, it transformed that unease into something more dangerous: clarity. She began to see with an unsettling lucidity what this connection could never be. It would not offer the architecture of ordinary romance. There would be no gradual construction of a shared future, no language of plans or continuity, no comforting narrative that framed closeness as something that could be managed over time. What existed between them did not belong to tomorrow. It belonged to the immediacy of now, and now demanded everything. She felt the absence of guarantees with a force that unsettled her more than any overt risk could have. In her previous relationships, uncertainty had been masked by structure. Even when commitment was withheld, there had been rituals, expectations, the illusion of progression. Here, there was nothing to lean on. No promise of where this was going. No reassurance that what she gave would be met with something equally enduring. There was only choice, repeated in each moment, stripped of the comfort of continuity. She became acutely aware that the safety she had once mistaken for maturity had always been a form of retreat. The men she had loved before had offered her a version of intimacy that preserved her autonomy by limiting the stakes. She could be close without risking dissolution. She could be desired without surrendering the parts of herself that were most vulnerable. She had called this balance. Now she recognized it as protection. With him, that protection did not exist. Not because he sought to dismantle it, but because what passed between them did not acknowledge it. His presence did not invite her to remain intact. It did not accommodate the boundaries she had drawn to ensure she could leave without loss. Near him, intimacy did not soften the edges of herself. It sharpened them, brought them into focus, demanded that she confront what she had spent years guarding. She began to understand that what she had once called love had been carefully calibrated to avoid the possibility of being undone. She had chosen men who allowed her to remain separate, who did not require the kind of surrender that might cost her the structure of her identity. It had felt dignified. It had felt strong. But it had also been empty in ways she had not been willing to admit. The closeness she had known had never asked her to risk her own coherence. Here, everything was reversed. Closeness did not preserve her. It threatened to unmake her. The more she allowed herself to remain near him, the more she felt the architecture of her self-control begin to strain. Not collapse, not shatter, but bend under the pressure of something that did not conform to the limits she had imposed. She could feel the edges of who she believed herself to be becoming porous. She had always equated love with mutual accommodation, with the careful shaping of oneself to remain compatible with another. What existed here was something she had no framework for. It did not involve adjustment or negotiation. It did not invite compromise. It existed in a state of raw proximity, where two presences met without the mediation of narrative or expectation. There was no buffer of intention to soften what was happening. It was not cruel. It was simply uncompromising. She sensed, with a growing intensity, that remaining in this space meant accepting a form of vulnerability she had never permitted herself. Not the vulnerability of being hurt by another person, but the vulnerability of allowing herself to be altered in ways she could not predict or control. This was not the familiar risk of heartbreak. It was the deeper risk of losing the shape of herself as she had known it. Her body responded to this awareness with a quiet tension that never fully resolved. She felt alert, awake, as though every nerve had been tuned to a frequency she had previously ignored. There was no comfort in this heightened state. It was not pleasurable in the conventional sense. It was exacting, demanding. It required her to be present in a way that did not allow retreat into thought or abstraction. She realized that this was the true point of no return. Not an external event, not a dramatic gesture, but the internal recognition that she could no longer pretend this encounter was simply another experience to be consumed and left behind. Something had already shifted. The part of her that had once believed she could move through intensity without consequence had been exposed as an illusion. To remain near him was to accept that whatever happened would mark her. She began to examine, with an honesty she had long avoided, the nature of her previous choices. She saw how often she had selected relationships that preserved her independence by limiting emotional depth. How she had avoided men who might require too much of her, who might ask her to give more than she could easily reclaim. She had told herself this was self-respect. Now, in the stark light of this connection, it looked increasingly like fear. What confronted her was not the possibility of losing him, but the possibility of losing herself in a way that did not involve disappearance, but transformation. The language she reached for was not romantic. It was existential. To love here would mean allowing the boundaries that defined her to be reconfigured. It would mean stepping into a form of closeness that did not promise preservation. She stood before an internal precipice she had never fully acknowledged before. On one side lay the life she knew how to inhabit, autonomy guarded by distance, intimacy managed through restraint, connection that did not threaten the coherence of her identity. On the other side lay something she could not yet articulate, only sense. A closeness that did not guarantee safety, a love that did not promise she would remain the same. She understood that there was no neutral ground between these two states. To withdraw now would not return her to who she had been before encountering him. The awareness she had gained could not be undone. She could choose to step back into the structures she knew, but she would do so with the knowledge that they had always been a form of avoidance. To remain, however, was to step into a territory where the familiar markers of selfhood might dissolve. The gravity of this realization did not paralyze her. It clarified. She saw that what she had always feared was not abandonment, not betrayal, not even pain. What she had feared was the loss of the version of herself that had learned to survive by remaining untouched. She had built her life around the preservation of that self, even as it quietly starved. In his presence, the starvation became impossible to ignore. The hunger she felt was not for affection, but for something more demanding, a connection that did not allow her to remain safely outside of herself. She did not know whether she desired this in the way she had once desired love. What she knew was that the alternative now felt like a retreat into a form of existence that had already proven insufficient. She became aware of how often she had mistaken control for integrity, how she had equated the ability to leave with strength, how she had structured her relationships around the principle that nothing should be allowed to matter too much. It had protected her from devastation, but it had also insulated her from transformation. With him, control was no longer the currency. Presence was. She felt the tension between the instinct to preserve herself and the pull toward something that did not honor preservation. This was not a struggle between desire and reason. It was a struggle between two visions of selfhood, one defined by boundaries that ensured continuity, the other defined by the willingness to be altered by encounter. The closer she remained, the more she sensed that what he offered was not companionship, not security, not even love in the conventional sense. What he offered was a space in which she could no longer maintain the careful separation between who she was and what she felt. He did not promise her a future. He did not ask her to sacrifice anything. And yet, in his presence, she could feel the possibility of sacrifice becoming inevitable. She recognized that love, as it existed here, was not an addition to her life. It was a subtraction. It threatened to remove the scaffolding she had built around her identity. To love in this way would mean allowing parts of herself to dissolve into something she could not fully anticipate. It would mean risking the coherence she had fought so hard to preserve. She stood at this internal edge, aware that neither choice offered comfort. To leave would be to return to a form of intimacy that no longer satisfied her, to relationships that would allow her to remain intact but unchallenged. To stay would be to enter a realm where the familiar rules no longer applied, where love did not promise to preserve her, but to remake her. The world around her reflected this internal state. Nothing appeared stable. Light shifted without pattern. Sound seemed to lose its usual continuity. Time itself felt altered, not flowing forward, but hovering in a suspended present that demanded decision. She felt as though she were standing in the eye of something that could not be named, only entered or avoided. She did not yet choose in any definitive sense, but she understood that the moment of neutrality had passed. The point of no return was not an external boundary she could cross back over. It was the knowledge that what she had encountered had already disrupted the internal equilibrium she had spent years constructing. Whether she stepped forward or retreated, she would no longer be the woman who had walked into that place, seeking intensity without consequence. She acknowledged, with a clarity that both frightened and steadied her, that what was at stake was not the continuation of a relationship, but the continuity of a self. To remain would be to accept the possibility of being undone and remade in ways she could not foresee. To leave would be to preserve the version of herself that had learned to love without risk, without surrender, without the possibility of disappearance into another. The danger she felt was not that he might destroy her. It was that he might reveal what she had been protecting herself from becoming. In that revelation lay both terror and a strange, undeniable pull. She stood at the edge of that knowledge, aware that the world she had known could no longer contain what she was beginning to experience. The choice before her was not between him and herself, but between safety and truth. Between a life that allowed her to remain whole and a love that asked her to accept the possibility of being transformed. The point of no return was not a moment she crossed. It was the moment she recognized that remaining untouched was no longer an option. She attempted to return to the version of herself that had once felt sufficient, the woman who valued composure, who measured intimacy, who believed that independence was not merely a preference but a moral position. She moved back into the patterns that had defined her before him, the careful structuring of her days, the quiet satisfaction of autonomy, the sense of control that came from not needing anyone too deeply. On the surface, nothing appeared broken. Her life remained orderly. Her routines functioned. Her solitude was intact. Yet something in the texture of the world had changed. What had once felt calm now felt thin. The spaces she occupied no longer held the same density of meaning. Cafes, streets, rooms that had previously offered a sense of refuge now seemed drained of resonance, as though the world had been reduced to a series of surfaces without depth. She moved through her days with the same discipline she had always possessed, but beneath that discipline lay a quiet disorientation. She was not grieving a loss she could name. She was confronting an absence she could not ignore. Men who had once seemed steady now appeared curiously vacant. Their reliability, which had once comforted her, now felt like a hollow structure. Their attentiveness no longer reassured her. Their consistency no longer suggested safety. It suggested limitation. She found herself observing their gestures with a new, almost clinical awareness. The words they used to express interest sounded rehearsed. Their desire felt directed toward versions of her that she no longer fully inhabited. They wanted the woman who was composed, adaptable, easily integrated into their lives. They wanted what she had always been willing to offer. What unsettled her was not that these men were inadequate, but that she could no longer pretend their adequacy was enough. She recognized the familiar shapes of connection forming around her, the quiet invitations into relationships built on mutual accommodation and low emotional stakes. Once, these offers would have felt respectful, even generous. Now they felt like echoes of a life she had outgrown without realizing it. There was nothing wrong with them. There was simply nothing in them that reached the part of her that had been awakened. Her independence, which had once felt like an achievement, now registered as an expanse of silence. The freedom she had cultivated so carefully no longer read as strength. It read as absence. Not because she suddenly longed for companionship in the conventional sense, but because the solitude she inhabited no longer felt chosen. It felt defended. She had believed that autonomy was the highest form of self-respect. That needing less made her more complete. That remaining unattached was evidence of clarity rather than fear. Now, confronted with the afterimage of what she had experienced with him, she saw that her self-sufficiency had always been more fragile than she had admitted. It had not been built on abundance, but on avoidance. She began to trace the history of her choices with a precision she had never allowed herself before. She saw how consistently she had gravitated toward relationships that preserved her control by limiting emotional risk. How she had chosen men who did not require her to surrender the architecture of her identity. How she had structured intimacy in ways that allowed her to remain intact, unchallenged, untransformed. What she had called stability now revealed itself as a carefully maintained distance. She realized that she had never truly avoided love. She had avoided the vulnerability that accompanied genuine closeness. She had avoided the kind of exposure that did not allow her to remain sovereign over her inner world. She had avoided the pain that came not from loss, but from being seen too clearly, from allowing another person access to the parts of her that could not be managed or negotiated. He had become the mirror in which this truth was impossible to ignore. In his presence, she had not felt protected. She had not felt reassured. She had felt recognized in a way that bypassed the structures she had built to preserve herself. He had not offered her safety, and yet she had felt more present with him than she ever had in relationships that promised continuity. It was this contrast that now rendered her former life insufficient. She found herself returning again and again to the memory of how it had felt to be near him. Not in a romantic or nostalgic sense, but with an almost forensic attention to the internal shift it had produced. She remembered the way her usual strategies had failed in his presence, the way her instinct to retreat had been met not with pursuit, but with a steady, unyielding awareness, the way she had been forced to encounter parts of herself she had long kept hidden behind composure and control. In comparison, everything else now felt muted. She attempted to reinhabit her previous worldview, to convince herself that what she had experienced was an anomaly, an intensity that could be acknowledged and then set aside. She told herself that depth was not a requirement for a meaningful life. That fulfillment could be found in stability, in independence, in the quiet dignity of self-sufficiency. But the arguments rang hollow. They were not false, but they were no longer complete. She noticed the subtle ways her perception had altered. She no longer mistook politeness for connection. She no longer interpreted consistency as intimacy. The gestures that once signaled care now felt like rituals devoid of real engagement. Men who spoke of freedom while structuring their lives to avoid emotional risk now appeared transparent to her. She could see the choreography beneath the language, the careful maintenance of distance masquerading as respect. And she recognized it because she had practiced it herself. Her own freedom, once a source of pride, now confronted her as a question rather than an answer. What had she protected so fiercely? What had she preserved by refusing to let anyone come too close? The more she examined her life, the more she saw how often she had chosen not to need. How often she had translated longing into restraint. How often she had convinced herself that not asking for more was a form of wisdom. She had been strong, yes, but she had also been guarded. The distinction between the two had blurred so completely that she had stopped noticing it. The world without him did not collapse. It did not dramatize her loss. It simply flattened. The emotional terrain she once navigated with ease now felt strangely uniform. Where there had once been variation, tension, and complexity, there was now a smoothness that bordered on emptiness. She did not feel despair. She felt a quiet disillusionment, the kind that does not announce itself with pain, but with the steady erosion of meaning. She became aware that what she missed was not him as a person, but the version of herself that had emerged in his presence. A self that had not been comfortable, but had been alive. A self that had not been protected, but had been fully engaged. She missed the clarity that came from standing in a space where she could not hide behind the structures she had always relied on. This realization unsettled her more than longing ever could. She had always believed that the worst thing one could lose in love was the other person. Now she understood that what she had lost was an illusion about herself. The illusion that she was self-sufficient in a way that made deep connection unnecessary. The illusion that autonomy could substitute for intimacy. The illusion that one could remain untouched by life and still call it fullness. She saw now that her fear had always worn the language of independence. She had not avoided love because she did not believe in it. She had avoided the pain that came with allowing another person to matter enough to alter her internal order. She had avoided the vulnerability of being seen without defense. She had avoided the risk of discovering that her carefully maintained self might not survive true closeness intact. In him, she had confronted that fear directly. She understood that this confrontation could not be undone. Even if she never saw him again, the awareness he had awakened would remain. She could return to her routines, to her independence, to relationships that preserved her control, but she would do so with the knowledge that something essential was missing. The absence was not of a man. It was of a depth she had once touched and could no longer forget. She felt a quiet anger toward herself, not for what she had done, but for what she had denied. For the years she had spent equating emotional distance with maturity. For the ways she had diminished her own longing in order to remain unthreatened. For the compromises she had made in the name of self-protection, not realizing that they were slowly eroding her capacity to feel fully. At the same time, there was no self-pity in this recognition. There was only a stark clarity. She saw herself now not as strong in the way she had once believed, but as someone who had learned to survive by retreating from what demanded too much. She saw the defensive architecture of her life with an honesty that did not seek to excuse or condemn, only to understand. The men around her continued to offer what they always had: attention that did not require transformation, affection that did not ask for risk, intimacy that could be managed and controlled. She did not reject them out of disdain. She simply could no longer accept their offerings as enough, not because they were flawed, but because she had changed. Her illusions did not shatter in a single moment. They dissolved gradually, through the accumulation of small recognitions. Each time she felt the world flatten where it once had dimension. Each time she noticed how easily she slipped back into the familiar posture of self-containment. Each time she recognized that what she called peace was often nothing more than the absence of challenge. She understood now that the fear she had always carried was not of abandonment, but of exposure. She had been willing to endure loneliness to avoid the pain of being fully seen. He had forced her to confront that choice, not by demanding anything from her, but by existing in a way that made her defenses visible. She could not unsee what she had seen. Her loss was not of a relationship, but of the narrative that had sustained her. The narrative that told her she was complete in her distance, that she needed nothing beyond herself, that intimacy was optional rather than essential to a fully lived life. This narrative had allowed her to survive, but it had also constrained her. Now, in the aftermath of that recognition, she stood in a world that felt strangely diminished, not because it had changed, but because she had. The structures that once supported her no longer reached the depths of what she had become aware of. She did not yet know what she would do with this knowledge. She only knew that she could no longer return to the comfort of her illusions. They had served her once. They had protected her, but they could not contain the truth she had encountered. Her freedom no longer felt like a destination. It felt like a question. She did not arrive at the end in a moment of drama. There was no scene that could be isolated and named as the conclusion. What occurred was quieter, more exacting, a slow crystallization of understanding that could no longer be reversed. The choice she faced was not between him and someone else, not even between him and herself. It was between two ways of existing in the world. One built on preservation, on emotional insurance, on the careful management of risk. The other built on exposure, on intensity without guarantee, on the willingness to feel without demanding protection. She had spent much of her life choosing the first without fully acknowledging it as a choice. Safety had been disguised as wisdom. Restraint had been translated into maturity. Independence had been elevated into a moral position. These structures had allowed her to remain intact. They had also allowed her to remain untouched in the ways that mattered most. Now, in the wake of everything that had been awakened in her, those structures no longer felt sufficient. They did not collapse. They simply revealed their limits. She no longer believed that love needed to be sustainable in order to be real. The notion that something must last to justify its intensity now felt like a defensive argument rather than a truth. She began to understand that endurance and authenticity were not the same thing. A connection could be stable and still be empty. It could be brief and yet alter the architecture of a life. What she had encountered was not permanence. It was clarity. His presence had never offered her a future in the conventional sense. There had been no language of plans, no vision of continuity, no assurances that what existed between them could be translated into something recognizable. And yet, what he had given her was something she had never received in all the years she had spent cultivating safe connections. The experience of being fully awake in relation to another person. Not comfort, not reassurance, awareness. She began to see that what remained with her was not longing for him, but a fundamental shift in how she understood intimacy. He had not become the object of her choice. He had become the point of awakening through which she could no longer accept half measures. His role in her life was not that of a partner or a destination. It was that of a catalyst. He had revealed something essential and then stepped out of the frame of decision. This realization did not bring peace. It brought precision. She understood now that the question before her was not whether to stay or leave, not whether to protect herself or risk pain for the sake of one man. The question was whether she would continue to structure her emotional life around the avoidance of vulnerability, or whether she would accept the inherent danger of being fully present with another person. Not reckless danger, existential danger, the danger of allowing what she felt to matter without insurance. She did not choose him, and she did not choose against him. She chose something more difficult to articulate, the refusal to return to relationships that asked nothing of her heart beyond endurance. She chose the capacity to feel without scaffolding, without narrative guarantees, without the promise that what she invested would be returned in a form she could recognize. She chose a mode of being in which intensity was not something to be managed, but something to be honored, even when it did not offer safety. This was not a romantic decision. It did not carry the glow of fulfillment. It carried a stark honesty. She understood that by making this choice, she was not securing happiness. She was abandoning the illusion that happiness could be engineered through emotional restraint. She was accepting that whatever came next in her life would have to meet her in the place that had been opened within her, or not at all. She recognized that what she had previously called love had been built on conditions that protected her from being altered. It had been love without surrender, closeness without the risk of disappearance. She had believed this was strength. Now she saw it as a form of control that kept her from encountering the deeper dimensions of connection. The control had preserved her. It had also confined her. What she chose instead was not chaos. It was not a rejection of stability as such. It was a commitment to authenticity over endurance, to a form of intimacy that did not require her to be smaller in order to be safe, to a way of relating that did not guarantee survival of the self as she had known it. She understood that this path would not necessarily lead to a relationship that lasted. It might lead to solitude. It might lead to encounters that burned brightly and then vanished. It might lead to loss, to pain, to the kind of vulnerability she had spent years avoiding. But it would also lead to something she had only glimpsed until now, the experience of being fully alive within connection. The memory of him did not function as a wound. It functioned as a reference point, a proof that she was capable of a form of closeness that did not submit to the rules she had always lived by. His presence remained within her not as a longing for reunion, but as a measure of what she would no longer accept less than. He had shown her what it meant to be seen without mediation, to be recognized without being framed by roles or expectations. That recognition had altered her permanently. She did not romanticize the fire she chose. She did not imagine it as something that would always be beautiful. Fire, she understood, could illuminate and consume. It could warm and destroy. What mattered was not its promise of salvation, but its refusal to allow her to remain numb. She chose that refusal. She chose to live in a way that did not anesthetize her heart in the name of security. This choice did not result in an ending that could be neatly summarized. There was no resolution in the traditional sense, no declaration of outcome, no final scene of union or separation. There was only a shift in orientation, a redefinition of what she was willing to give herself to. She did not walk away because he was dangerous. She walked away because she had learned that she would no longer agree to forms of intimacy that did not demand something real from her. She carried with her the knowledge that safety, when elevated above all else, becomes another form of isolation. She had lived that truth for years without naming it. Now she named it. And in naming it, she released herself from its authority. The clarity she arrived at was not comforting. It did not soften the edges of what lay ahead. It did not promise that what she chose would lead to fulfillment. It promised only that she would no longer betray her own capacity to feel deeply, that she would no longer translate fear into virtue, that she would no longer confuse self-protection with self-respect. She understood that from this point forward, she would be alone in a different way than before. Not alone in the sense of isolation, but alone in responsibility. Responsible for honoring what had been awakened in her, even when doing so made her life more precarious. Responsible for choosing connections that did not ask her to mute herself in order to belong. This was not a rejection of love. It was a redefinition of it. She did not seek to preserve the version of herself that had walked into that place searching for intensity without consequence. That woman had been shaped by years of compromise disguised as wisdom. The woman who emerged from this experience was not more certain, not more secure, but more honest. She knew now that the heart could not be protected without also being diminished. That to avoid risk entirely was to avoid transformation entirely. The world did not rearrange itself around this choice. Streets remained streets. Days continued. People continued to offer what they always had. What changed was the way she would meet what was offered. She would no longer accept closeness that asked nothing of her. She would no longer participate in relationships that preserved her at the cost of her aliveness. She did not choose fire because it was beautiful. She chose it because it was real, because it demanded presence rather than compliance, because it did not allow her to remain half-engaged with her own life. In the end, what she carried forward was not the memory of a man, but the awakening of a capacity within herself. The capacity to feel without guarantees, to love without scaffolding, to risk being altered by what she encountered. That capacity did not promise safety. It promised truth. The story did not close with peace. It closed with clarity. She was no longer searching for a love that could be made safe. She was no longer willing to trade depth for durability. She had chosen the fire not because it would save her, but because it would not let her remain unchanged. And in that choice, She finally stepped into a life that did not ask her to be smaller in order to survive. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.